Prepare to unlearn. There is a story that sounds comforting enough to avoid questioning. The story that there is a strong, organized, progressive or socialist left actively confronting the global economic system. A left that supposedly challenges capital, imperialism and structural inequality. A left that claims to represent the real interests of ordinary people. But what if this image is, to a large extent, a performance? What if much of what today is called the progressive or socialist left is not a threat to the system at all, but one of its stabilizing mechanisms? This question is uncomfortable because it challenges identities, not just ideas. Political identities are defended emotionally, not analytically. Still, if we want to understand how the world actually works, not how we wish it worked, we have to move through that discomfort. If this already caught your attention, subscribe to the channel now. This space isn't about defending labels, it's about dissecting power. Let's continue. Historically, the left emerged as a direct response to the material organization of society. It spoke about who controls the means of production, who appropriates surplus value, who sets the economic and political rules. It spoke about class, exploitation, structure, and real conflict. None of this was symbolic. None of it was aesthetic. None of it was comfortable. It was dangerous. That's why it was repressed, criminalized, persecuted, and often violently destroyed. Not because it advocated inclusion or diversity, but because it threatened the logic of accumulation itself. Today, in much of the Western world, that kind of left barely exists anymore. In its place, something else has emerged, something softer, something that speaks the language of morality instead of power, something that criticizes excesses but leaves foundations untouched, a left that adapts itself to global finance, that accepts financialization as a given, that avoids confronting central banks, sovereign debt, capital flows, monopolies, and transnational corporations. This left operates within clearly defined boundaries, boundaries that were not imposed violently but gradually internalized. It can criticize billionaires as individuals as long as it doesn't question the system that produces them. It can speak against inequality as long as it avoids structural ownership. It can defend social causes as long as it doesn't threaten the global market logic. That is precisely why it is tolerated. More than that, it is needed. Every system requires a controlled opposition. It needs a political force capable of channeling dissatisfaction without allowing rupture. It needs conflict that looks real, but never reaches the core. The contemporary progressive left fulfills this function perfectly. It offers language for revolt, without offering tools for transformation. Look closely at how this left behaves when it reaches power. The promises are ambitious, the rhetoric is bold, hope is mobilized. But soon enough, the same explanations appear. There are limits. The market would react. Investors need confidence. Institutions impose constraints. Those constraints are never challenged. They are accepted as natural, and this reveals something fundamental. Real power is not where progressive discourse claims it is. It is not only in parliaments. It is not only in executives. It is not only in elections. It resides in financial flows, international agreements, debt systems, global supply chains, multilateral institutions, technological monopolies, and investment funds. As long as these structures remain untouched, politics becomes management, not transformation. And here lies the farce. Because this left continues to present itself as anti-systemic while governing entirely within the system's parameters, it legitimizes itself as an alternative while preserving the architecture that produces inequality. This is not accidental, it is functional. A genuinely radical left, radical in the structural sense, would immediately face economic sabotage, capital flight, media warfare, and political destabilization. History demonstrates this repeatedly. So the fact that a left is broadly accepted by major media outlets, billionaire-funded foundations, multinational corporations, and elite academic institutions should raise questions. Revolutions are not sponsored by the systems they seek to dismantle. Yet the institutional progressive left often portrays itself as a permanent victim of the right, of conservative media, of misinformation, of a supposedly backward population. Rarely does it see itself as part of a larger arrangement. This posture creates a deep disconnect between discourse and lived reality. While this left debates symbols, language, and moral performance, millions of people struggle with material insecurity, debt, precarious work, and fear of the future. And when those people fail to identify with progressive discourse, they are labeled ignorant, manipulated, or reactionary. The left that once claimed to represent the people now lectures them. That is not emancipation. That is alienation. If you recognize this contradiction, leave a like now. It helps this kind of analysis reach those who feel something is wrong, but haven't found the words for it yet. Socialism, in its origins, was never about aesthetics or moral signaling. It was about power. Economic power, political power, collective power. It was materialist, not performative. When that foundation disappears, what remains is managerial progressivism, an attempt to make the system more inclusive without making it less exploitative. That's why, despite decades of progressive governments across multiple countries, wealth concentration has only increased. Financialization has deepened. Corporate power has expanded. Labor has become more insecure. And yet the narrative persists. The problem is that progressivism hasn't gone far enough. This explanation protects the system from deeper critique, because admitting that contemporary progressive politics does not threaten capital would require admitting something far more uncomfortable. The political field itself has been domesticated. The real divide is no longer between left and right, but between what can be questioned and what is treated as untouchable. And global capital is untouchable. The farce of the progressive left lies not in its declared values, but in what it refuses to confront, in what it labels unrealistic, too radical, or outside the debate. Whenever someone attempts to recenter material power, they are marginalized. Regardless of whether they come from the left or the right, they become a threat to discursive stability, and discursive stability is essential for systemic stability. If you're still here, subscribe to the channel. What follows goes even deeper, connecting this farce to the rise of authoritarian movements, the hollowing out of democracy, and the deliberate failure of political alternatives. The transformation of the left into a brand did not happen overnight. It was gradual, subtle, and highly effective. Capitalism did not defeat its critics by silencing them alone. It learned to absorb them. What once stood in opposition was repackaged, sanitized, and resold. Critique became content. Resistance became identity. Politics became lifestyle. Today, in many spaces, being progressive carries little risk. It requires fluency in the right vocabulary, alignment with the correct symbols, and adherence to a moral code that signals belonging. But it does not require confronting ownership, accumulation, or structural power. This version of the left is fully compatible with large corporations, as long as those corporations adopt the appropriate language. They can exploit labor across global supply chains, crush competition through monopolies, influence legislation, and extract public subsidies, as long as their branding reflects progressive values. Capital learned how to speak the language of justice, and the institutional progressive left accepted the deal. In exchange for visibility, funding, access, and legitimacy, it abandoned the most dangerous parts of its own critique. Structural questions were replaced with cultural ones. Economic confrontation was replaced with symbolic victories. This produces a dangerous illusion, the feeling that society is moving forward while inequality deepens beneath the surface. The farce becomes even clearer during moments of crisis. Economic collapse, inflation, war, financial instability. These are the moments when power is exposed. And in those moments, progressive governments almost always retreat into the same logic they once claimed to oppose. Suddenly, there is no alternative to austerity. Suddenly, fiscal discipline becomes sacred. Suddenly, markets must be reassured. The language shifts, but the outcome is familiar. The costs are socialized downward. The sacrifices are demanded from those with the least power. And all of this is justified as responsibility, realism, or maturity. This is not betrayal in the dramatic sense. It is consistency with a role, the role of managing capitalism more gently, not replacing it. And this has consequences. When material conditions continue to deteriorate despite progressive leadership, frustration does not disappear. It accumulates, and that frustration seeks an outlet. This is where authoritarian and reactionary movements thrive, not because they offer real solutions, but because they understand something the progressive left forgot. Politics is not primarily about moral coherence. It is about power, fear, loss, and control over material life. While the progressive left speaks in abstractions, the reactionary right speaks to concrete anxieties, job loss, cultural displacement, economic insecurity, loss of status, loss of future. These movements present themselves as anti-systemic precisely because the institutional left has abandoned that space. And in doing so, it hands the language of rebellion to forces that ultimately serve the same economic interests. This is the paradox. A left that refuses structural confrontation ends up strengthening the very forces it claims to oppose. If this analysis resonates, leave a like now. It tells the algorithm that long-form, critical thinking still matters. Another rarely discussed aspect of this farce is how internal dissent is treated. Historically, leftist movements were defined by debate, disagreement, and ideological struggle. Conflict was not a weakness, it was a sign of life. The contemporary progressive left, however, demands moral unanimity. Divergence is framed as betrayal. Structural critique is often dismissed as harmful, divisive, or dangerous. This creates intellectual stagnation. Without internal critique, movements ossify. They become defensive. They prioritize image over substance, and they lose the capacity to adapt to reality. The result is a political landscape where options appear polarized, but outcomes converge. Elections feel dramatic, but material conditions remain largely unchanged. The spectacle intensifies while power consolidates. People sense this, even if they cannot articulate it. That is why voter disengagement rises. That is why cynicism spreads. That is why trust collapses. And when people say politics doesn't change anything, they are not expressing apathy. They are expressing experience. Socialism, stripped of its material core, becomes a hollow signifier. It becomes something you claim, not something you build, something you perform, not something that reorganizes society. Identities can mobilize attention. They cannot redistribute power. This is the central failure of the progressive left as it exists today. Not that it wants too much, but that it demands too little from the structures that dominate our lives. The uncomfortable truth is this: the system does not fear this left. It understands it. It anticipates it. It knows how far it will go. And anything that predictable is not a threat. A left that does not challenge ownership, capital mobility, financial sovereignty, or imperial structures is not radical. It is managerial. It manages inequality. It manages dissent. It manages expectations. If you are still listening, subscribe to the channel now, because questioning power requires spaces that are not afraid of discomfort. The goal of this analysis is not to dismiss struggles for rights, dignity, or inclusion. Those struggles matter, but without a confrontation with material power, they remain vulnerable to co-optation. Justice without redistribution becomes branding. Equality without structural change becomes narrative. Progress without power becomes illusion. The real danger is not that people will abandon progressive ideals. The danger is that those ideals will continue to be used to legitimize a system that produces the very injustices they claim to oppose. So the question is not whether the progressive left has good intentions. The question is whether it is willing to become dangerous again. Because throughout history, no meaningful transformation occurred without threatening entrenched power. And any movement that refuses to do that will always be allowed to exist. Think about that. Prepare to unlearn.